It's the summer of 1972. The Cold War is at its peak. The United States and the Soviet Union are pointing thousands of nuclear warheads at each other. The world measures superpower strength in megatons and tank divisions. Nobody, not in Washington, not in London, not even in Moscow, sees what's coming, because what's about to shift the balance of power isn't a weapon, it's a harvest failure.
The Soviet Union was the largest country on Earth. 11 time zones, some of the most fertile agricultural land on the planet, including the legendary Black Earth Belt stretching across Ukraine and southern Russia. Theoretically, it should have been feeding half the world. But the Soviet agricultural system was a catastrophe hiding in plain sight. Collective farming, central planning, and a workforce with zero incentive to produce had kept crop yields stubbornly below Western levels for decades. Then, nature delivered the knockout blow. The winter of 1972 was brutal, with almost no snow cover to protect the winter wheat. What followed was a scorching, relentless summer that burned the fields across the Volga region and Kazakhstan. The harvest didn't just underperform, it collapsed. The Kremlin was staring at a shortfall of millions of tons of grain, and they were terrified. This wasn't just an economic problem. It was an existential political emergency. In the Soviet system, the legitimacy of the Communist Party rested on one simple promise: we will take care of you. Bread was subsidized, it was cheap. It was the foundation of the Soviet diet. No bread meant riots, and the leadership remembered perfectly well that food shortages had helped ignite the Russian Revolution in 1917. Hungry people, as history repeatedly proves, are dangerous people. So the Soviet leadership made a decision that was equal parts desperate and brilliant. They would not impose rationing, which would be a humiliating public admission of failure. Instead, they would go to the international market and buy their way out of the crisis on a scale never before attempted in human history. And here was the audacious part. They would buy it from their arch enemy, the United States of America.
But there was a problem. If the Americans realized how desperate the Soviets truly were, the price of grain would explode overnight. Washington would weaponize food, demanding political concessions in exchange for wheat. The Soviets needed to be invisible. They needed to pull off a heist. They sent a team of hard-nosed trade negotiators from a state agency called Export Club to New York City. Not diplomats, not spies in the traditional sense, grain buyers. They checked into luxury hotels and started making phone calls. The American grain market at the time was dominated by a handful of massive private companies, the Big Five, including Cargill, Continental Grain, and Louis Dreyfus. These companies were fiercely competitive and pathologically secretive. They didn't share information with each other, and they certainly didn't share it with the U.S. government. That secrecy was the Soviet weapon. The Soviet buyers invited executives from each of the Big Five to separate, private meetings. To every single company, they told the exact same story. Just a modest purchase, they said. Standard commercial transaction, nothing unusual. They approached Continental Grain and quietly bought a few million tons. Continental, believing they had landed an exclusive deal, agreed at the current low market price without hesitation. Then the Soviets walked out and went straight to Cargill. Same pitch. Same price, same result. Then Louis Dreyfus, then Cook Industries. Because these companies refused to communicate with competitors, none of them had any idea the Soviets were simultaneously buying from everyone. Within weeks, in July and August of 1972, the Soviet Union had secretly purchased roughly 19 million tons of American grain. That was approximately 1/4 of the entire United States wheat crop.
They bought it at subsidized export prices, funded by American taxpayer credits, while the U.S. Department of Agriculture sat completely unaware, assuming this was just a minor uptick in trade.
When the truth finally surfaced, the markets detonated. The grain companies, suddenly realizing they had sold more wheat than they actually had in their silos, scrambled frantically to buy grain from American farmers to fulfill their contracts. The surge in demand was instantaneous and enormous. In August of 1972, wheat was trading at around $1.60 a bushel. By September, it had jumped past $2.25. It kept climbing. And it wasn't just a number flickering on a trading screen in Chicago.
American families felt it at the grocery store. The price of bread went up. The price of meat went up because livestock feed had become more expensive. Poultry and eggs followed. Ordinary Americans were paying more for food because their own government had effectively subsidized the sale of their own wheat to their Cold War enemy at rock-bottom prices.
The press dubbed it the Great Grain Robbery, and the name stuck. It was a public relations catastrophe for the Nixon administration, but for the Soviet Union, it was a masterpiece of economic espionage. They had secured enough food to prevent famine, stabilized the regime for another year, and played the capitalists at their own game. Except the triumph was an illusion wearing a very expensive mask. The Great Grain Robbery was the moment the mask slipped entirely. It exposed to anyone paying close attention the fundamental structural weakness of the Soviet system. A superpower that cannot feed its own people is not a superpower. It is a dependency dressed in military uniforms. The Soviet Union had just traded its geopolitical dignity for bread, and worse, it had become addicted. Because this wasn't a one-time purchase. The failure of Soviet agriculture wasn't caused by bad weather. It was caused by a broken ideology. The collective farms weren't going to fix themselves. The farmers working the land were essentially state employees with no stake in the harvest. Whether the crop failed or flourished, they received the same meager wage. There was no incentive to work harder and no penalty for wasting. Up to 30% of the entire grain harvest and 50% of the potato crop rotted before it ever reached the consumer because there were no proper silos. The roads from fields to cities turned to mud in autumn rains, and potatoes were simply dumped in open piles to freeze and decay. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union had become the world's largest importer of grain. Ships laden with American, Canadian, and Australian wheat were constantly docking at Soviet ports. The Kremlin was buying social peace with hard currency, and the bill kept growing. In 1980, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo, declaring he would not sell food to a nation that invades its neighbors. A bold moral stance, but it backfired badly. The Soviet Union simply turned to Argentina, Canada, and Australia. The embargo hurt American farmers far more than it hurt Soviet dinner tables. It proved that food, while genuinely a weapon, is an extraordinarily difficult one to aim with precision. Then the 1980s arrived, and the house of cards began to shake. Oil prices, which had been generating the hard currency Moscow used to buy grain, collapsed in the mid-80s. The rivers of petrodollars turned to trickles. At the same time, Soviet agriculture continued its slow, grinding decline. Tractors were aging. The rural workforce was shrinking and struggling with widespread alcoholism, and the Chernobyl disaster drained additional billions from an already hemorrhaging budget. Mikhail Gorbachev arrived in 1985 with a genuine desire to reform.
But he had inherited a system that was biologically dependent on its enemy. He couldn't simply stop importing food without triggering famine. The trap set in 1972 had finally snapped shut. The Soviet Union began borrowing massively from Western banks, primarily in Germany and France, to pay its food import bills. They were borrowing money to eat.
By 1989, Soviet external debt had reached $50 billion, a significant portion of which existed simply to service grain purchase obligations. The final act was almost unbearable in its irony. The harvest of 1990 was actually a good one. The fields were full. But the economic system had collapsed so completely that the state could not buy grain from its own farmers. The ruble was worthless from hyperinflation. Farm directors refused to sell for paper money and instead hoarded grain, waiting for better terms or bartering it for fuel and equipment. The fields were full and the cities were starving simultaneously. In 1990 and 1991, the Soviet Union, the nation that had put the first human being into space, was reduced to accepting humanitarian food aid from the West. The United States sent massive shipments of frozen chicken legs to Russia. Russians called them bush legs, named after President George H.W. Bush. The sight of American chicken arriving in Moscow was for millions of ordinary Russians the psychological end of the Cold War. The propaganda that had promised them for decades that capitalism was collapsing stood exposed as a complete lie. It was the Soviet Union that was collapsing. It was the Soviet Union that needed charity. The Soviet Union didn't die on a battlefield. It didn't end in a nuclear exchange or a dramatic military defeat. It died in the bread queue. It died because it tried to run a modern industrial society without a functioning market. It tried to be a superpower while being unable to feed its own people. The 19 million tons of grain purchased in the shadows of New York City in the summer of 1972 weren't just a commodity transaction. They were the seeds of the empire's destruction, planted quietly in the fertile soil of desperation and ideology, watered for 20 years by borrowed money and borrowed time. The kernel of wheat, it turned out, was more powerful than the atom bomb. If you found this story as remarkable as I do, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Because the greatest turning points in history are almost never the ones that make the loudest noise. They are the quiet ones, signed in hotel rooms, loaded onto ships in the dead of night, and felt 20 years later in the breadlines of a crumbling empire. I'll see you in the next one.